They called her a barren tree, useless, a cracked jar, a woman whose only purpose was to bear fruit, but whose branches remained stubbornly, shamefully empty. Her own father sold her for less than the price of a steer, shoving her into the dusty market square like a sack of spoiled grain. She can cook, sew, and keep quiet, he barked to the crowd, his voice thick with whiskey and resentment. Faulty inside, but her hands still work. Mabel stood there, the sun beating down on her head, the shame a hot brand on her cheeks. She remembered her wedding dress being torn from her back, the jeers of her mother-in-law, the cold finality in her husband's eyes as he cast her out for a younger, promising new wife. 2 years she had prayed. 2 years she had choked down bitter herbs from the midwife. 2 years of watching the moon wax and wane with a hope that shriveled a little more each month. And for what? To end up here. Sold, the crowd murmured, a mix of pity and scorn. No one stepped forward. Why would they? What good was a wife who couldn't give you a son? Her father's desperation soured the air. "Half price," he shouted. "Just take her off my hands." Then the crowd parted. A man moved through the silence, his steps heavy, deliberate. He was tall, broad as an oak tree, his shirt stained with sawdust and pine sap. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but you could see the hard line of his jaw, the rough calluses on his hands. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at her father. His eyes, tired but clear as a winter sky, found Mabel and stayed there. He didn't speak a word. He just reached into his coat, pulled out a worn leather pouch, and spilled a pile of coins onto the splintered table. It was more than enough. The sound echoed in the sudden quiet, a final, unarguable statement. Mabel's father, stunned, scooped up the money. "You sure? No refunds on this one." The tall man finally tore his gaze from Mabel and looked at her father. His voice was low, rough, like stones grinding together. "She won't be judged anymore." That was all he said. He turned and walked away, not even checking to see if she would follow. The crowd began to disperse, their show over. Her father gave her one last final shove. "Go on then. You're his now." Mabel picked up her small satchel, her fingers trembling around the one precious thing she had left. A silver locket with her mother's face inside. She followed the silent lumberjack, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Was this salvation? Or was it just a different kind of cage? He led her to a mule-drawn cart, waiting by the blacksmith's. He didn't help her up. He just waited, his silence a heavy cloak. The ride was long, stretching across endless plains of dry grass under a sky that went on forever. She snuck glances at him. His face was weathered, carved by wind and work, but he couldn't be much older than 30. No wedding ring, just a deep scar across one knuckle. Finally, her voice a tiny whisper against the creak of the wheels. She asked the question that had been screaming in her mind. "Why?" He didn't look at her. He just kept his eyes on the horizon. "Got 4 kids," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. "No mother. No time to find one the polite way." 4 children. So that's what this was. She wasn't a wife. She was a replacement. A hired hand bought cheap at market to look after his brood. A governess. "No," he said as if reading her thoughts. "Just someone who isn't cruel. That's enough." But as the sun began to bleed across the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of orange and blood, Mabel realized something wasn't right. The path they were on wasn't a main road. It was a barely there track, leading deeper and deeper into the whispering pine woods, away from any town, away from any sign of life. The silence in the cart grew heavier, more menacing. This wasn't just a remote cabin. This was isolation. This was the middle of nowhere. And she was alone with a man she didn't know, a man who bought a woman like he was buying a sack of nails. Maybe cruelty wasn't the only thing a person had to fear. The cabin looked like it had grown out of the earth itself, old and hunched and leaning against the wind. The porch sagged. A blanket was nailed over the doorway instead of a proper door. As they pulled up, 4 small faces appeared in the grimy window, then vanished just as quickly. They looked like frightened deer, ready to bolt. Silas, the lumberjack, grunted as he hopped down. "This is it." He gestured for her to follow. "This is Miss Mabel," he told the children, who were now huddled together in the single dark room. She'll be staying. 3 boys, 1 little girl, all with the same wide, suspicious eyes. The youngest, a toddler, clung to Silas's leg, burying his face in the rough denim. "Room's upstairs," Silas said to Mabel, pointing toward a rickety ladder. "There's warm water in the bucket." She climbed, her legs shaking so badly she could barely find her footing. The room was tiny, just a cot and a small window overlooking the endless, dark woods. She sat on the edge of the mattress, the straw rustling beneath her. She didn't weep. The tears were frozen somewhere deep inside her. This was her life now. A tiny room in a broken-down cabin, mother to 4 children who looked at her like she was a ghost and bound to a man who spoke in shadows and silences. The first few days were a blur of clumsy mistakes. She burned the beans. The bread refused to rise. She tried to mend a tear in the oldest boy's shirt, and her hands, once so nimble, felt stiff and foreign. The children watched her every move. The oldest, Josiah, had eyes that were too old for his face, narrowed with distrust. The girl, Hannah, wouldn't let go of her father's pant leg. They were like a pack of wild pups, wary and ready to snap. Silas never criticized her. He never raised his voice. When she dropped a heavy pot of stew, sending it crashing across the floorboards, she flinched, bracing for the blow that had always followed failure in her old life. But Silas just walked over, picked up the pot and said, "It's only stew." His lack of anger was almost more unnerving than a shout would have been. What did he want from her? What was he hiding behind that stoic, unreadable face? One evening she found it. She was sweeping the floor near the hearth, trying to bring some semblance of order to the chaos, when the broom handle knocked against a loose floorboard. It shifted just slightly. Curious, she knelt down, prying at the edge with her fingers. It came up easily. Underneath wasn't dirt. It was a small, hollowed-out space, and inside, nestled on a piece of old cloth, was a woman's silver hair comb, intricately carved with roses. It was beautiful, expensive, far too elegant for a place like this. But that wasn't what made her blood run cold. Tangled in the silver teeth of the comb was a single, long strand of dark hair, and beside it, a small folded piece of paper. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was feminine, looping and graceful. The note was short, just a few desperate words. "He knows he won't let me leave. Pray for me." Suddenly, the silence of the cabin wasn't peaceful. It was predatory. The children weren't just shy. They were scared. And Silas wasn't just a quiet man. He was a man with a secret buried right under his own floor. Who was this woman? Where had she gone? And what did Silas know about it? The blanket over the door flapped in the wind, and for the first time Mabel understood that the real prison wasn't the one she'd been sold into. It was the one she had just discovered she was already in. Mabel tucked the note and the comb back into their hiding place, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. Every creak of the cabin, every shadow that danced on the walls, now seemed to hold a sinister meaning. She watched Silas, searching his face for any crack in his stony facade, but there was nothing. He chopped wood, mended a fence, and ate his dinner in the same unnerving silence. He was a locked box, and she was beginning to fear what was inside. A few nights later, a storm rolled in, a monster of wind and rain that rattled the very bones of the house. The world outside was a churning, violent darkness. Inside, it was even worse. The little girl Hannah began to cry, a thin, whimpering sound that quickly escalated into a pained shriek. Mabel rushed to her side. The girl's forehead was burning, her skin slick with a feverish sweat. Silas stood in the doorway, a giant frozen in place, his face a mask of helplessness. He looked at his daughter, then at Mabel, his eyes filled with a raw, unfamiliar panic. I don't know what to do," he stammered. Something inside Mabel snapped into place. The fear receded, replaced by a fierce, protective instinct she didn't know she possessed. "Boil water," she commanded, her voice clear and steady, "and bring me willow bark from the pantry, and mint leaves. Now!" He moved without question. For the rest of the night, Mabel was a whirlwind of motion. She brewed a bitter tea from the bark, crushed the mint leaves to make a cooling paste, and bathed Hannah's forehead with cloths dipped in cool water. She murmured old lullabies, her voice a soft, constant anchor in the storm-tossed room. The children watched from the corner, their fear slowly turning to awe. She didn't sleep. She didn't stop. When the first weak rays of dawn filtered through the window, the storm outside had passed, and inside, Hannah's fever had broken. The little girl opened her eyes, blinked up at Mabel, and whispered one hoarse word: pancakes. Mabel felt a wave of dizzying relief. She looked up and saw Silas standing in the doorway, his arms folded, his shoulders slumped. He wasn't looking at Hannah. He was looking at Mabel, his expression one she couldn't decipher. It was more than gratitude. It was something closer to shock, as if he'd just witnessed a miracle he didn't believe was possible. Later that morning, after she'd gotten the children dressed and fed them a thin porridge, she found a mug of steaming tea waiting for her on the table. Beside it was a small, awkwardly folded note. The handwriting was stiff, blocky, nothing like the elegant script from beneath the floorboard. "Thank you," it read. That was all. She held the warm mug in her hands, the strong, pine-scented steam rising to her face. A simple thank you. But it felt like a peace offering. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe the note under the floor was from a long time ago. Maybe Silas was just a man broken by loss, not a monster hiding a crime. She allowed herself a small, fragile glimmer of hope. That hope was shattered that very afternoon. She was tidying the children's sleeping corner, smoothing out the thin blankets, when her hand brushed against something hard under Josiah's pillow. Curious, she pulled it out. It was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, but tucked under its wing was another piece of folded paper. She recognized the looping, feminine handwriting immediately. This note was different. It wasn't desperate, it was angry. "He won't let me see my son. He keeps him locked away from me. If you find this, tell the sheriff that Silas is a monster. He stole my child." Mabel's breath hitched. "My son, not our son." She looked at the 4 children huddled by the fire. 3 boys, 1 girl. Was one of them not his? Was Josiah, the quiet, watchful oldest boy, the stolen child? And if Silas had stolen him, what had he done to the mother? The hair comb, the desperate notes, the stolen child. It was all starting to form a terrifying picture. Silas hadn't just saved her from the market. He'd brought her here for a reason. He needed a mother for these children because he'd gotten rid of the real one. The cabin, once just a place of quiet dread, now felt like a tomb. Every object seemed to hold a clue, every silence a confession. Mabel moved through her days in a state of high alert, a prisoner playing the part of a housekeeper, waiting for the jailer's mask to slip. She was kind to the children, efficient in her chores, and offered Silas a calm, placid face, all while a storm of terror raged inside her. The note said Silas had stolen a son. She watched Josiah, the oldest. He was quiet, sullen, and fiercely protective of his younger siblings. He rarely smiled, and he followed his father's orders with a grim obedience that felt born of fear, not love. Was he the one? Or maybe it was Eli, the loud, boisterous middle son? Or even little Benji, the toddler who was just starting to talk? She didn't know, and the not knowing was a special kind of torture. One afternoon, Silas announced he was going into town for supplies. It was the first time he would be leaving her alone with the children for an extended period. "I'll be back by dusk," he said, his eyes scanning her face. "You'll be all right?" "Of course," she said, her voice betraying none of her inner turmoil. The moment his cart disappeared down the wooded track, she sprang into action. She had to know more. The note mentioned a sheriff. That meant there was a town, a law, a world outside this suffocating clearing in the woods. But where? And how far? She couldn't risk taking the children. Her only chance was to find more proof, something undeniable she could take with her when she finally made her escape. She went straight to the locked room, not the one upstairs where she slept, but a small, sturdy door off the main room that Silas always kept bolted. She'd seen him go in there once or twice, but he'd never explained what it was for. A storeroom, she'd assumed. Now she was sure it was something else. The bolt was thick, but the wood of the door frame was old and soft. Using the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, she began to pry at it. It was hard, splintering work. Her hands grew raw, but adrenaline fueled her. Finally, with a loud crack, the wood gave way and the door swung inward. It wasn't a storeroom, it was a bedroom. But it was perfect, untouched. A thick layer of dust covered everything, but underneath it was a woman's room. A quilt with a rose pattern was folded neatly on the bed. A dress the color of a summer sky hung from a peg on the wall. On a small, beautifully carved nightstand sat a leather-bound book, a diary. Her heart pounded as she picked it up. This had to be it. The truth. She opened it to the first page. The elegant, looping script filled the page. My dearest Ilara, the entry began, on the occasion of our wedding, I give you this book, that you might fill it with the story of our life together. With all my love, Silas. Mabel's hands shook. Ilara. That was her name. The woman from the notes. She flipped through the pages. The early entries were filled with hope and love. Talk of building the cabin, of planting a garden, of their first child, Josiah. But then, the tone began to change. The entries grew shorter, more strained. Silas works too hard, one entry read. He has no time for me. The woods press in on all sides. I feel like I'm suffocating. Another months later. A new family has settled in the valley. The Jennings. The father is a powerful man, a cattle broker. His son is handsome, but weak. I find the father compelling. He speaks of the world beyond these trees. Mabel froze. Jennings. That was her married name, her ex-husband's name. What was going on? She read on, her eyes flying across the page. Ilara wrote of secret meetings with the elder Mr. Jennings. She wrote of passion, of promises to run away together, and then the most chilling entry of all. I have told Silas I am leaving him. He did not rage. He did not yell. He just looked at me with those dead eyes and said, "You will not take my son. He has locked me in. He is a monster." The final entry was dated 2 years ago. The ink was smudged as if by tears or rain. Jennings is coming for me tonight. We will take what is mine and escape this prison. If I do not write again, it is because Silas has stopped me for good. Mabel slammed the diary shut, gasping for air. It was all there. The affair with her ex-father-in-law. The stolen son, Josiah, was Silas's son, but Ilara was planning to take him. And Silas had stopped her. He had killed her. He had buried his wife somewhere, out in these dark woods, and had been living a lie ever since. A floorboard creaked behind her. She whirled around, the diary clutched to her chest. Silas stood in the doorway. He wasn't supposed to be back until dusk. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on the diary in her hands. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken violence. You weren't supposed to see that, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. He took a step into the room. The door swung shut behind him, plunging them into shadow. The world narrowed to the dusty, shadowed room, and the man standing between Mabel and the only exit. Her mind raced. The axe he used to chop wood was just outside. The hunting rifle was mounted over the fireplace. He had killed once to keep his secrets. He would do it again. Silas, she began, her voice a reedy tremor. You think you know what happened, he said, taking another slow, deliberate step toward her. He wasn't angry. He was something far scarier. He was sad. You think you figured it all out, don't you? She backed away until her legs hit the edge of the dusty bed. She held the diary up like a shield. She was going to leave you. She was going to take your son. My son, he repeated, a bitter, hollow sound. Yes, my son. He stopped, just an arm's length away. But you've only read her side of the story. His gaze dropped to the diary. Ilara had a talent for writing stories. She could make you believe almost anything. Before Mabel could react, he lunged, not at her, but at the bed. He reached under it and pulled out a small locked wooden box. He produced a key from his pocket, unlocked it, and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on velvet lining, was a stack of letters. He took one out and handed it to her. Read it, he commanded. Her hands trembled as she took the letter. The handwriting was a man's, bold and arrogant. It was addressed to Ilara. My dearest, it began, the plan is set. I have convinced my fool of a son that his wife, Mabel, is barren. He will cast her out soon. Once she is gone, and you are free of that oaf Silas, we can finally be together. Our fortunes combined will make us the most powerful family in the territory. It was signed, Your Love, Thomas Jennings. Mabel felt the blood drain from her face. Thomas Jennings, her ex-father-in-law. This whole time, her infertility had been a lie, a cruel, calculated scheme cooked up by her father-in-law and Silas's wife so they could be together. She wasn't barren. She had been betrayed in the most profound way imaginable. She wasn't just leaving me, Silas said, his voice thick with a pain that was years old. She was part of a plan to ruin an innocent woman. You, to get what she wanted. She was going to abandon her other 3 children without a backward glance. She didn't love Josiah more. She loved what he represented. A final insult to me, a prize to take to her new life. So what happened? Mabel whispered, the diary feeling heavy and useless in her hand. The last entry. Jennings came for her, Silas said, his eyes dark with the memory. I heard them arguing outside, by the old well. She was telling him she wouldn't leave without Josiah. He was telling her to forget the boy, that they had to go now. I went out to confront them. He paused, swallowing hard. It was dark. They were struggling. She was holding a letter. That letter, the one you just read. She was threatening to expose him if he didn't help her take the boy. He tried to grab it from her. She slipped. Mabel stared at him, her heart pounding. Slipped? The old well, Silas said, his voice barely a whisper. The cover was rotten. She fell. It was. Instant. Jennings, the coward, he just stared down into the darkness. Then he turned and ran. He left her there. He just ran. He looked at Mabel, his face a roadmap of grief and exhaustion. I couldn't report it. Who would believe me? A poor lumberjack against the most powerful man in the county? He would have said I killed her. He would have taken my children. So I buried her. I told everyone she ran off. And I have lived with that secret every single day since. The truth was so much more complex and heartbreaking than she could have imagined. Silas wasn't a murderer. He was a victim, just like her, trapped by the same man's ambition and cruelty. They were 2 sides of the same tarnished coin. Suddenly, a commotion from outside broke the spell. Shouts, the sound of horses. Mabel and Silas rushed out of the room. A group of men on horseback were in the clearing. In the lead, looking smug and triumphant, was a man she recognized instantly, the town sheriff. And right beside him, pointing a trembling finger at the cabin, was the drunken trapper, Jed. That's him, Sheriff, Jed shouted, his voice slurring but loud. That's the man who killed his wife. I saw him. I saw him bury the body. The sheriff dismounted, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. Silas, he said, his voice carrying a grim authority. Jed here says he saw you bury your wife, Elara, out by the old well 2 years back. Says you've been threatening him to keep quiet ever since. Silas stood tall, his face pale but resolute. He didn't look at Jed. He looked at Mabel. In that one look, a universe of despair passed between them. It was over. The lie had finally caught up to him. He was going to lose his children. He was going to hang. And it was all based on the word of a known drunk and the whispers of a town that had always seen him as an outsider. It's not true, Mabel said, stepping forward. Her voice was surprisingly strong. He's lying. The sheriff gave her a dismissive glance. And who are you? The woman he bought at market. I don't think your testimony's going to hold much weight, ma'am. He turned back to Silas. You're coming with us. No! Josiah, the oldest boy, suddenly ran out of the cabin and stood in front of his father, his small body a defiant shield. You can't take him. He didn't do anything. The sheriff sighed, annoyed. Son, step aside. But then something happened that changed the entire dynamic of the clearing. A wagon moving much too fast came rumbling up the track. It wasn't Silas's mule cart. It was a finer vehicle, pulled by 2 strong horses. The driver pulled the reins hard, bringing the wagon to a skidding halt. And the person who climbed down was the last person Mabel ever expected to see here. It was her ex-husband. He looked terrible. His clothes were rumpled, his face was drawn and pale, and he looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He ignored the sheriff, ignored Silas, and walked straight to Mabel. "Mabel," he said, his voice cracking, "I have to tell you something. I was a fool, a coward." He took a deep breath. "It was never you. It was me. I'm the one who's barren. I can't father children." A collective gasp went through the small crowd. The sheriff looked confused. Jed the trapper looked startled out of his drunken haze. "My father," her ex-husband continued, the words spilling out of him in a desperate torrent. "He couldn't stand the shame. He's obsessed with the family name, with his legacy. He forced me to lie, to blame you. He's the one who arranged for you to be cast out." He looked past her, his eyes landing on Silas. "And he's the one who had an affair with your wife, Alara. He promised her everything." The sheriff's jaw dropped. "Mr. Jennings? The town elder?" "Yes," Mabel's ex-husband said, his face crumpling. "He's a monster. He found out Jed was spreading rumors about Silas, so he paid him. He gave him money and whiskey to go to you, Sheriff, and tell this lie about Silas murdering Alara. He wants this land. He wants Silas gone, silenced forever, so no one ever finds out what he did." It all clicked into place. This wasn't about justice. It was a land grab, a final, brutal move by Thomas Jennings to bury his secrets for good. He was using the law, using a drunk's greed, to eliminate the one man who could expose him. "My father killed her ex-husband said, the words a choked whisper. "He confessed it to me last night, in a rage. He said she was threatening to expose him, and they fought, and she fell into the well. He left her there to die." The clearing was dead silent. The truth, ugly and raw, hung in the air. Jed the trapper suddenly looked terrified, realizing he'd been a pawn for a real murderer. The sheriff looked from the broken man who had just confessed everything, to the silent lumberjack who had carried the burden of another man's crime, to the barren woman who was at the center of it all. "Silas," the sheriff said, his voice quiet, respectful, "is this true? Is that where she is? In the well?" Silas finally spoke, his voice heavy. "I gave her a proper burial, under the old oak tree." He pointed to a small, unmarked rise at the edge of the woods. "She was a lot of things, but she was still the mother of my children. She deserved better than to be left in the dark." The sheriff looked at his deputy. "Ride into town, arrest Thomas Jennings for the murder of Ilara and for conspiring to frame an innocent man." He then turned, his gaze sweeping over the scene. The terrified children, the ramshackle cabin, and the two people, Silas and Mabel, who had been drawn together by one man's treachery. He shook his head slowly. "I reckon you've all been through enough," he said, tipping his hat to Mabel. He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving behind a silence that was no longer filled with fear, but with the fragile, shocking light of truth. In the aftermath, the clearing felt strangely peaceful. The departure of the sheriff and his men had taken all the tension with it, leaving a quiet stillness in its wake. Mabel's ex-husband stood awkwardly for a moment, his face a mess of shame and relief, before climbing back into his wagon and leaving without another word. His confession had cost him everything, but in doing so, he had given her and Silas back their lives. Jed the trapper had sobered up fast. He mumbled an apology to Silas, his eyes darting everywhere but at the man he'd tried to send to the gallows. And then he scurried off into the woods like a frightened rabbit. They were alone again, just Mabel, Silas, and the four children, who were now clinging to their father, their faces buried in his legs. Mabel looked at Silas. The secrets that had stood between them like a thick wall of glass had been shattered. She saw him clearly for the first time. Not a monster, not a jailer, but a man who had endured an unspeakable tragedy and had borne it in silence to protect his family. He had built a fortress of solitude around himself and his children, and now the walls were finally coming down. He met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw no shadows in his eyes. Only a profound, bone-deep weariness, and something else. A quiet, desperate gratitude that left her breathless. He started, but his voice failed him. She didn't need him to say it. She walked over to him, gently disentangled the children and sent them inside with a soft word. When they were alone, she reached out and took his rough, calloused hand. It was the first time they had touched not out of necessity, but out of choice. You don't have to carry it alone anymore, she said, her voice soft. He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face. A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. When I saw you at the market, he said, his voice raspy with emotion, I knew. Your ex-father-in-law, Jennings, he used to boast about his weak-willed son and his barren wife. When I saw you there, being sold, I knew you were the woman from his stories. I knew you were innocent. I bought you. I thought I was giving you a way out, a safe place. I never meant to pull you into my own darkness. You didn't, she said, squeezing his hand. You gave me a home when I had none. You gave me a purpose when I thought I was useless. She looked toward the cabin, where the children were peeking out the window. You gave me a family. That night something shifted. The children, who had always kept a careful distance, now seemed to see her differently. Josiah, the stoic oldest boy, came to her while she was washing the dishes and quietly started drying them, his shoulder brushing against hers in a gesture of silent solidarity. Hannah, the little girl she had nursed through the fever, crawled into her lap by the fire and fell asleep. Later, after the children were tucked into their beds, Silas came and sat beside her on the worn hearth. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. For a long time, they just sat in comfortable silence. I ain't ever been a good talker, he finally said, staring into the flames. But I need to say this. I figured you'd leave once you had your footing, once the truth was out. And I won't hold you to what started as a sale. You're free to go, Mabel. If that's what you want, I won't stop you. She turned and looked at him, at his strong profile illuminated by the firelight. She thought of her old life, of the big empty house, the false smiles, the constant crushing judgment. Then she thought of this place, this messy, imperfect, broken cabin that had become her sanctuary. She thought of the children's laughter, the feeling of Hannah's small head resting on her shoulder, the quiet respect in Silas's eyes. What if I don't want to go? She asked softly. He turned to face her, his expression full of a hope so fragile it almost broke her heart. I used to think my life was over, because my body couldn't create a child, she said, her voice gaining strength. But here, with your children, I've learned that motherhood isn't just about blood. It's about showing up. It's about nursing a fever in a storm. It's about protecting them with a truth they're not even old enough to understand. She took his hand again. If you're not sending me away, Silas, then I'm staying. He didn't say anything. He just leaned forward, slowly, cautiously, and pressed his forehead against hers. It wasn't a gesture of passion, but of something deeper, more profound. It was a gesture of homecoming. Thank you, he murmured against her skin, for staying long enough for us to love you. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying away the ghosts of the past. Inside, by the warmth of the fire, a new story was just beginning, not one written in a secret diary or based on cruel lies, but one they would build together day by day, out of the ashes of their broken lives. The years that followed were quiet ones, but it was a healing quiet, filled with the small, everyday sounds of a family putting itself back together. The news of Thomas Jennings's arrest and subsequent conviction was the talk of the territory for a season, but out in their secluded clearing, it was just a distant echo. Their world was the cabin, the woods, and the slow, steady rhythm of their life. Mabel discovered she had a gift for making things grow. She cleared a patch of land behind the cabin, turning the hard, unforgiving soil with a stubborn determination. She planted seeds, corn, beans, tomatoes, and tended to them with the same fierce care she gave the children. The garden flourished under her touch, an explosion of green life against the dark backdrop of the pines. It became her sanctuary, a place where her hands, once deemed useless, created abundance. The children, once wary and wild, softened and opened up to her like flowers in the sun. They started calling her Mama, first as a hesitant question, then as a simple, undeniable fact. It was a name she had never expected to hear, and every time they said it, it mended a piece of her that she thought had been broken forever. Silas changed too. The heavy weight he had carried for so long lifted from his shoulders, and the silence that had once defined him was now filled with easy comfort. He would sit on the porch steps in the evenings, carving small wooden animals for the children, while Mabel sat beside him, mending clothes. They rarely needed to speak. They had learned to understand each other in the quiet spaces, in shared glances and small, unconscious gestures of affection. One crisp autumn afternoon, he came to her, while she was working in her garden, her hands covered in dirt. He didn't say anything, just handed her a small object he'd been carving. It was a bird, intricately detailed, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. She smiled, turning it over in her palm. "It's beautiful." "It's a wren," he said, his voice low. "They say they're plain birds, but they got the prettiest song. They build strong nests in unlikely places." He looked from the bird in her hand to her face. "Reminds me of you." Her heart swelled. In all her life, no one had ever said anything so poetic, so perfectly true to her. She stepped forward, rose onto her toes, and pressed a soft, gentle kiss to his lips. It was their first. It tasted of pine smoke, autumn air, and a love that had grown slowly, quietly, and strong enough to withstand any storm. They were married by a traveling preacher the following spring, not in a church, but right there in the garden, surrounded by the children and the life they had built together. There were no fancy clothes or grand pronouncements. It was just a simple, quiet promise to continue what they had already begun. Years melted into a decade. The children grew. Josiah, the quiet, watchful boy, grew into a quiet, dependable man, with his father's strength and Mabel's steady kindness. He took over much of the work in the woods, his axe swinging with the same rhythmic precision as Silas's once had. Eli and Benji grew tall and rowdy, their laughter a constant, joyful noise around the homestead. And Hannah, the little girl who had almost been lost to a fever, blossomed into a young woman with her mother Alara's beauty, but none of her restless discontent. She had Mabel's gentle heart. One day, a surveyor from the government came out to the property. He carried maps and spoke of a new railroad line that was planned to cut right through their land. He offered them a generous sum of money, enough to buy a fine house in town, enough to start a new, easier life. Silas and Mabel listened politely, standing side by side on the porch of the cabin that had once been a prison and was now their entire world. When the man was finished, Silas simply shook his head. "This land isn't for sale," he said. The surveyor was taken aback. "But sir, this is a fortune. Think of what you could have." Silas looked out past the man, his gaze falling on the sprawling garden, the sturdy cabin with its crooked porch, the oak tree where he had buried his first wife, and the woman standing next to him, her hand resting in the small of his back. He saw the ghosts of their past and the promise of their future, all rooted in this one small patch of earth. "We already have everything," he said, and his voice held no room for argument. The railroad was eventually built, but it curved around their hill, leaving their little homestead untouched, an island of quiet defiance in a changing world. Travelers on the train would sometimes catch a glimpse of the lopsided cabin in the vibrant garden, a splash of impossible color against the wilderness, and wonder about the people who lived there. They wouldn't know the story of the barren woman who had been sold for coins, or the silent man who had been haunted by a crime he didn't commit. They would only see a home, and they would be right. Because Mabel, the woman they called a barren tree, had learned that some roots don't grow in the womb, they grow in the heart. And here, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by a man who cherished her and the children who called her mother, she had finally truly bloomed. If you were moved by the story of how Mabel and Silas found a family in the most unlikely of places, then you found your home here with us. We believe that the greatest love stories aren't always the prettiest ones. They're the ones forged in fire, built on resilience and earned through grit and grace. These are the stories that remind us that your worth is not determined by what others say you are, but by the love you choose to give and the life you have the courage to build. If you want more tales of redemption, justice, and the kind of love that can make a garden grow in the harshest of soils, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to write a new chapter. And let us know in the comments below. What do you think is more powerful, the blood you're born with or the family you choose. We'll see you next time for another story from the wild heart of the past.